Welcome to Liberty Lounge. I'm Max Stenner, and here is my co-host, Samuel Turner.
Hello.
Our first guest today is William Clouston, who has been the leader of the Social Democratic Party, the SDP, since 2018. He is a former punk drummer and district councillor, and is the party's candidate for Hexham in the next election. Our next guest is William Fotheringham-Bray of Reform UK, who is the party's candidate for Sittingbourne and Sheppey in Kent, which is the highest polling Reform UK constituency in Kent. Onwards.
Hello. So, the big news this week has been that the House of Lords has voted against the government's Rwanda bill for the third time after the government rejected all of the amendments made. So that'll be going back to the Commons. So the real question is the House of Lords fit for purpose? Let's start with William Clouston.
It clearly isn't fit for purpose, and we can do a lot better. Until the present SDP policy is to abolish it, and there are some good grounds for abolishing it. But the SDP conference last year, there was a motion tabled to retain it and reform it, and all of that motion actually failed. I think they got 66% of the vote. We need 75 to change policy. We're very likely to honour it, and I think we will retain and reform. It's too big, it's unwielding, and there are some very good people in the Lords, but it's. I've always been against it personally on principle, basically. The SDP is quite constitutionally conservative in some ways, but I don't think you can justify unelected cronies having the power they have. On the other hand, the present arrangements that we have with the Supreme Court don't work very well. It's basically an American import. So we'd probably be better off with some law lords back and some law lords that were appointed with some scrutiny from the Commons. So the whole thing is a mess. Just you preface the whole question on Rwanda. We need to talk about that, but
yeah.
I'm not fussed about what the Lords is doing to the Rwanda bill, because I think the whole Rwanda thing is just a publicity stunt. So I'm not really concerned with that.
Okay, thank you. I like your answer. Yeah, I also agree it's a gimmick. But yeah, Fotheringham-Bray. What do you think about this? The House of Lords rejecting the Rwanda. Do you agree with Mr. Clouston's stance?
Yeah, I find myself pretty hard to disagree with Mr. Clouston's analysis of that. I believe, the House of Lords is becoming incredibly filled with cronies who, do not deserve the positions that they've been given. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, they appointed Boris Johnson's hairdresser to be a peer within the House of Lords. I don't know where that went with that, but I'm pretty certain that that's something he tried to do. But it definitely does need to be changed to get the cronies out of it. I think it got a lot worse around Blair's time, and that just continued into the Conservative period. So it's about kicking the cronies out and having either abolishing the Lords and having a representative chamber like how they do in the Netherlands. They have a elected lower and upper chamber, or just because as someone who is big royalist myself, it'd be a shame to see such an old and venerated chamber of representatives be removed after such a long time. But at the same time, we need to think about how we can keep our democracy healthy and how we can push forward with that. In regards to the Rwanda bill, again, I agree with you, Mr. Clouston. It is very much a gimmick, and actual serious debate needs to be had about real tenable changes that we can make to the immigration system. But when it comes to the House of Lords, change is most definitely required, and it's in our name, funnily enough, reform.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it's really encouraging that smaller parties are calling for democratic reform when it's so lacking from the main two parties. But yeah, moving on to immigration, it's been calculated that the Rwanda plan will cost the UK 1.8 million for each migrant deported. Isn't this just a huge waste of money? And what other better ways do you think there would be to reform asylum and deport illegal migrants to countries when they can't be returned to their home country, for example, like Afghanistan, which obviously isn't safe.
The question of whether, obviously, the Rwanda scheme is costing some hundreds of millions. We're paying Rwanda hundreds of millions. But that is actually, if you can solve the migrant crisis, that might be very cheap. But the problem is, I don't think the Rwanda scheme does have any chance of solving it. There are 3 or 4 major problems with it. First is that it fetters, in principle, it fetters the UK's border control to a foreign state. Very foolish thing to do. I mean, what happens if, Paul Kagame is unlikely to lose an election for various reasons, but what happens if he did lose an election? And then you lost your place of deportation. It won't, on the scale that the Rwanda scheme is, it can't act as a deterrent, because it's hundreds of people, not thousands. So you can't, there's a limit to how many people you can deport to Rwanda. And I think it's just a sort of act of cowardice, really, on the part of the political class, the establishment political class. What's happened is these people that govern us they lie to the public, and they have no intention of getting control of the border. To get control of the border, you would have to have in government someone with a bit of bottle, basically. And the steps that you need to take to get control of the border are to withdraw from the post-war asylum protocols, to withdraw from the ECHR, and adapt our own Human Rights Act to remove the provisions that give unsolicited arrivals the chance to go through legal means to stay. Presently, the vast majority of people who arrive here will stay, and it's hugely costly. I think the only way you could seriously look at the chaos that we have on the South Coast is by changing the incentives. To change the incentives, you have to do something like the SDP policy, which is anyone that arrives unsolicited will be transported to, we say British overseas territories. We're talking about Ascension Island, essentially. You'd be deported to Ascension Island, you would stay there, you'd be incarcerated, and you would go to either the country you came from or another country. You would never be granted asylum to the UK. Now, you saw what the government can do when it wants to do something in lockdown. It built Nightingale hospitals, it got its act together and did things. I would want the sort of state that would be capable of doing that. I would build a large reception centre on Ascension Island. Let's say it could accommodate a few thousand people. I don't believe if you intercepted every single person who was coming across the channel in this way, every single one, not 99%, 100%, and you transported them immediately to that jurisdiction, I think the flow would stop overnight. People pay 5,000 or 6,000 euros currently. That's the price to get across. It's a brilliant deal for the asylum seeker, because for the price of 5,000 euros, you get access to the British social wage and all health, housing, education benefits going forward. And Jan van der Beek and his team from Amsterdam University have helped the whole of Europe, because they've produced this borderless welfare state report, which was published in Dutch last year, and late last year was published in English. And it calculates that the cost to Holland of sub-Saharan African asylum seekers is something like 630,000 euros per person across the lifetime. The cost of having an open border of this kind is colossal. It's not. I think our figures will be quite similar. I think it's not unreasonable to surmise that the cost of allowing, say, 100 people to arrive and settle here in these terms would be, 100 people will cost you 50 million quid. This is crazy. This is absolutely crazy. So even if it costs quite a few millions, even billions, to stop this flow, it's worth stopping it. And as a Democrat, given the fact that most British people want it stopped, we must stop it. But I would say to the voter, don't waste your time voting Labour or Conservative or Lib Dem or Green, because none of them will stop it.
Yeah, I think I agree. It is an issue of democracy, and who controls the border? Is it criminal gangs, or is it our democratically elected government?
Right.
So, Fotheringham-Bray, what do you think about the? I think Reform agrees that we should withdraw from the ECHR, but what
Oh, yeah,
about
most certainly.
deportations and Ascension Island?
I like the idea of the Ascension Island, sending the Ascension Islands an overseas British territory. I believe I heard an idea also from Patrick Christie recently about setting up centres on British unoccupied British islands such as the Isle of Scilly and the Isle of Hebrides, something along those lines to process them about that. But the Ascension Islands is it's quite an interesting idea. And sorry, I'm waffling. Getting to what you were saying about the leaving the ECHR, yes, that is definitely one of Reform's bigger ideals when it comes to dealing with illegal immigration. It's I believe it's point 2 in our 6-point plan towards stopping the flow of illegal immigration dead. Pardon me, sorry. And but when it comes to illegal migration, it is about stopping the financial benefits versus the risks of coming to the United Kingdom for illegals, because a lot of them don't come from countries that are in a state of peril. Like, a lot of them are economic migrants. So we saw recently a fair chunk of them are coming from Albania and Morocco and Algeria, places that are not in a state of crisis. They're not being invaded. There isn't a civil war. There isn't a major famine. There isn't anything like that. There isn't anything like what's happening in Afghanistan. So it's about, they're coming here because they want the economic privilege of being in Britain. So to do that, we need to make sure that we can stop the human traffickers, which is like the major issue of this. So under the 1974 Solus Act and the 1982 UN Convention on the Law at Sea, we can legally turn these boats around and send them back to France. And the moment they come back to France is the moment that they will engage with the human traffickers and say, you told me that I was going to get to Britain if I gave you 5,000 euros, as you said, Mr. Clouston. And now that word of mouth spread, and people don't trust human traffickers anymore to get them to where they need to go. So the moment we send back one, it sends this cascade of people not trusting human traffickers anymore, and just basically shutting down this illegal trade of people coming across to our shores, especially here in the south, where I've spoken to people who are affected by this personally, as someone who lives down here in the south. So I've had to go and I had to give my support and create designs for people who are campaigning to stop an asylum centre opening in Faversham. It's quite heartbreaking, because you see people in their communities not getting the democratic representation that they are entitled to. They're not getting told by their councils that, oh, by the way, we're just going to drop a bunch of people here who you don't know. That you don't know what their intentions are. We don't know who they are. They're just here now. We're going to pop them in your community, and we're going to pray everything's okay. It's abysmal. It really is. So once we can address that, once we address the issue and we come up with the plan, we have the plan that is to stop this illegal immigration in its tracks. We implement an Australia type model, which we've seen to work, and we make them stop. And we need to have the political will to do it, because I've spoken with other PPCs, such as Alan Cook, who's our Bromley and Biggin PPC, and he's been within the House of Commons, and he's spoken to conservative MPs who have told him that the only reason we're not doing this, we're doing what Reform is saying we want to do anyway, is because we don't have the political will to do it. We're afraid of being labelled all sorts of anti-humanitarian, all sorts of things. It's about stealing yourself and saying, no, we need to think about our people first, because if we don't have our people first, we don't have our nation first. We don't have a nation.
Yeah, William.
So that's how I would respond to that.
What do you think about that, William Clouston?
Largely right. I mean, I think William's right in the sentiment, and he's clearly on the right page. I think the only slight difference. I mean, but on the final point that you made, William, I think I totally agree. If you don't have border, you won't have a country in the end. And it's the future of Western civilization that rests on this. One day, I'm hoping, to my calculation, there's only 2 states in the world that are sort of Western European states. I know they're not in Europe, but New Zealand and Australia have control for geographical reasons, legal reasons. But virtually every other Western state doesn't, and it's absolutely existential, critical that we deal with this. I slightly disagree with on the pushbacks. I don't think a pushback at sea would survive the first capsize politically. Forget it. So don't even try and do it. I wouldn't fetter, just as I was unwilling to fetter the policy to Rwanda, I wouldn't fetter it to France either. France has taken lots of money and has never got a grip on controlling the casting off at sea in shallow water of boats. So they've never done it. Also, the other thing, William, it's not in their interest to do it. They want to move these people on. Yeah. Just the same as this is why the border of Ventimiglia is now under check, between France and Italy, because every nation state, all the old rules are reasserting themselves. Every nation state's on its own. I just wish we had a political class that understood, as William said, that they're meant to be acting in our interests. Yeah. This isn't a charity. This country isn't a charity. It's not a shop either. My criticism of the way we've been run economically is based on, I think, the liberal economics crew think the country's a shop. Everything's for sale. I think the social liberals think it's some sort of charity. It's an NGO. It's not an NGO. It's a country. And if you don't have a border, you won't have a country. So the SDP's policy is very get an active state together on your own territory and sort it out. And I promise you, if you transported, if every single person that tipped up on the south coast was brought to Brize Norton straight off to Ascension to have a little bit of think, it would stop overnight.
Yeah, it's interesting talking to I'm an SDP member and talking to young SDP members.
So am I.
And Max as well. Yeah,
I'm just a little bit outnumbered.
They do seem to be quite extreme in some ways in terms of talking about pushbacks and a more militaristic response. I mean, I've never seen it as been very practical.
It won't work. It can't work. A pushback at sea, particularly it's okay in the summer. I promise you, a pushback at sea politically would not survive the first capsized boat. That you could kill 50 people. Yeah. It's never going to happen. That's never been a practical solution. What is a practical solution? Having control and intercepting transporting every single person that's an unsolicited arrival. It's reasonable to have control of your borders. I mean, William mentioned the act from the early 1970s, and Section 32 does render it illegal to arrive here. Yeah. So there's no question we could do it. But I agree, it's because the political class don't want to. They could do it. And again, anyone thinking about voting Tory in the next election, just don't, because they've had their chance. They had a majority, the best part of 70, 80, and they didn't want to do it. They never did it. If you can't get border control when you've got a majority of 80, you never will get border control because you don't want to. And again, I think William's right. Largely, the reason is because the Tory party's chock-a-block full of liberals that don't want to appear illiberal at middle-class tea parties in London. That's what it amounts to. That's what's at stake.
Yeah, I agree. I saw this Suella Braverman interview, and she was saying that she was the only one in the cabinet saying we should leave the ECHR, and all the others were against it. But Max, I think you had a question on legal economic immigration.
What levels should the immigration system be at in an ideal world? So, William Fotheringham-Bray.
Right. Well, so ideally, we need to get it much lower than where it was, last year. So last year we had around 600,000 net people entering the UK. So that's roughly the size of Birmingham in terms of population. We need to desperately put that down because that's going to require a lot more housing, and it's going to dig into our green belt, and it's going to lower our expectation. It's going to lower our standard of living as an overall, because we can't build up to match that quickly enough. So my ideal level would probably be somewhere below 100,000 per year. That, if just saying straight, I'd try and get it as low as 100,000 a year. I think realistically, that's what I would try and get it down to.
Okay. Yes, and William Clouston, I think SDP policy is 50,000 net migration. Is that right? And then 20,000 refugees a year.
Yeah, that's the policy. So if we did that, we'd be doing very well, considering what's happened recently. Yeah, I mean, the economy needs skilled migration, and it's inhumane to prevent people that fall in love and get married not to live here. I mean, as those are the basics. I also think that it's a good idea to have quite a tight legal migration, work visa migration system. Because why? Because if it's tight, you of necessity you have to have the very best. And the difference, I published an interview today on SDP Talk, it's on our YouTube, with Garrett Jones, an academic from the United States. Is unfortunately in the queue of videos, interviews on SDP Talk. It's behind Rod Little's question time things for some reason, so it's struggling a bit. But it's an excellent interview. If you can get very skilled migrants to settle, it boosts your productivity. It increases investment, and you basically get the skills that those migrants bring, and the effects on public finances of high skilled migration are that, as I say, your productivity is boosted, but also these people are largely tax positive. They contribute, they're net contributors over their lifetimes, and we need them. I mean, life sciences in the varsity triangle, are booming. And if high school people want to come in, it's essential they are allowed to. Numbers are very significant. You can't have what we've had. What we've had is a complete utter chaos free for all. It's been reckless. I mean, anyone that can could tell you that to have net migration, because remember the SDB's policy is every time I speak to people like David Goodhart and I say I want to get net migration down to 50, he says, that's really tight. The experts say it's tight, but it could still be 250,000. It could still be 300,000 because it's net. 300,000 people leave, so there's a bit of a con. The British people are slightly conned. I don't think anyone's got a grip on it. But certainly, what's happening now is off the scale, reckless. I think what we've got is a government that's panicking about economic growth and is disinterested or unable to train the 5.5 million people on how to work benefits to get into effective work. They just haven't prioritized that. And I keep on saying, I mean, the immigration problems that we have, which have major economic problems, as I said before, read the Van der Beek study. There's two. I mean, Van der Beek study, and it's the best European study on the costs of unskilled migration or asylum migration. And actually, Van der Beek said in Holland they shouldn't have any. That's all he said. It's that serious if you look at the figures. But read that study, and then read Garrett Jones's book, the guy I interviewed today, on culture transplant. Then you can have a rational debate about migration. I try to keep my family out of politics, but we are quite we're full of lots of immigrants in our family and lots of different people from different places in the world, and you can't make the world into a place where people can't migrate or won't migrate. It's not rational to do that. But very unskilled migration of the level we've had, and on the numbers we've had to Britain is just stupid and reckless. You know, you can't house going to live. You have a net migration figure of 650. That implies 2.4 people per household. It implies something like 300,000 houses. We've never built. We've never built that. So this is reckless policy, and luckily the public are behind us. We both Reform and the SDP need to go quite hard on this. I know people think it's quite controversial, but I think if you do it, if you do it for well, if it's well-meaning and intellectually sound, a policy of our type, which is to end mass migration, is needed, and will probably get quite a lot of support.
Yeah, no, I agree with the ambition, and I think the cultural argument is particularly strong about the changing culture. But I've always asked, when I talk to other people, I always ask them, but how practically would you achieve that in terms of how would you deal with labour shortages? And then looking at the university sector, a lot of SDP members I've met, they basically want to drastically reduce foreign students, and stop them from staying in the UK after post-study. So on a practical sense, starting with you, William Clouston, how would the SDP adjust to the labour shortage, which I think like 900,000?
This will also connect to the declining birth rate.
Yeah, that's another issue. Yeah,
I'm not so fussed about the birth rate issue. I think a society that wants to, care for its elderly and have a tax base which is sufficient, even though population could decline, can do it. And I still think, if you look at countries like South Korea and Japan, I would prefer to live in South Korea or Japan, despite their falling birth rates and falling populations, than, for instance, most states in West Africa who are having booming populations. That's a separate point. We've never tried. This is my gripe. We've never tried. What's happening is we've got 5.5 million people on out-of-work benefits, and doctors are signing them off every week, and that 5.5 million is going to be 7 million quite soon. Plus, we've got another few million who are not on benefits but are out of the workforce. We've never incentivized these populations to get in, and the reason that we don't is just harder to do it. Sometimes what happened post-Brexit, what we said from the left-wing point of view on Brexit, was that mass immigration discourages training and it reduces wages. And after Brexit, we had labour shortages and people had to start paying truck drivers and other people more. Well, I thought, good, let's have that.
Yeah.
I think British people will do any job if you pay them well. And I don't think that adaptation will happen without a degree of, you might call it adaptation or pain. You might just call it pain. But no government's prepared to pay the price. So they reach for the drug cabinet of mass migration. They panic and they bring, and that is going to prove more costly in the long run. But they're not bothered about the long run because the country's knackered in the end. They don't care. They're trying to get through the next year.
Yeah, and Mr. Fotheringham-Bray, how would reform deal with the shortage? Would you look at incapacity benefit, perhaps reforming welfare as a solution?
Well, I mean, I find it quite difficult to disagree with anything Mr. Clouston said. He sounds a lot like what Mr. Tice is saying. When it comes down to dealing with the with labour shortages, it is about incentivizing the people currently out of work benefits. The 5 to 7 million people are out of work benefits, and actually encouraging the British people to get out there and do the work that needs to be done in order to have a society that works at all of its levels in regards to that. So yeah, basically more or less the policy, it seems, between the SDP and Reform there are pretty similar in that regard. He's practically said everything I would say in regards to that question.
Here's my next question. What issues are the most important to people in the general election this year?
Oh well, I think that the answer to that is pretty obvious, and it comes down to the immigration issue. Because everyone I've spoken to, whether it be on the street, whether it be in a pub, whether it be at my workplace, it's always about immigration. It's about the constant culture clash that we are getting onto in regards to people coming from abroad, bringing their ideals and not assimilating into the British way of life, and just that clash. You've seen it with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and how a conflict from the other side of the world almost is affecting the streets of London. It's ridiculous. So it comes down to really finding a way to reduce immigration. That is, I think, everyone's priority, except maybe Sadiq Khan. But
Sadiq Khan's always a bit of the odd one out.
yeah.
And William Clouston, I know. What do you think is the biggest issue? I know. Would you want the SDP to focus more on cultural issues like immigration and identity politics, or more on the economy and public services?
I think, well, if you look, to answer the question, if you ask the public, immigration is either, I think it's second nationally, and it's on voting. The former Conservative voters is number one. We've talked about immigration, and that is a massive issue in the next election. But the two issues which I think are the second issue, I think, to immigration is probably housing. I think housing is an issue which it's slightly regionally variant, in that in the north there are routes, there are housing stock in Yorkshire and northeast, northwest. Isn't so tight that you can't get onto the housing ladder somewhere if you want to. So it's not as acute. But in the southeast, London southeast is off the scale, difficult, stroke impossible for young people. 40% of graduates go to get a job in London, and the London. If it were a person, the head's too big for the body. But if you get a job as a graduate, you might get a box room in Acton or Haringey or whatever for 800, 900 quid a month, and your route towards family life are just curtailed, basically closed off. It's unless you've got bank with mum and dad, and even if you have, it's very difficult. So housing is the issue, really. I mean, if you can't, and as a conservative, a social conservative, if you can't settle down and get to know your neighbourhood and build a life with the foundation of a house, a home, you're just failing people, and it's just outrageous. The cure to it is to repair the damage to the state sector in provision. It's something we probably do have differences with Reform UK on. And we certainly have differences with virtually every other party on it. I don't think we'll solve the housing crisis until we deal with immigration and we get the state back in the business of building houses at scale. I think you only need to look at the figures, the post-war completions in housing, to see that. It's one of these things that it's weird. It's staring at the destruction of state sector capacity as a cause of the housing crisis, staring you in the face, but virtually no one on the right will even look at it. So that's an important thing. But the other thing that I think that is not an issue, but which should be, is our appalling trade problem. This is not. If you look at data on issues, cost of living, even transport, housing, immigration all come higher. Health service comes higher. But I'm trying to introduce our trade problem as an issue, and I'm about the only politician nationally that talks about it. I don't actually think anyone else does, and it's massively important because we run these trade deficits and we get poorer, and we wonder why the tax base shrinks and public services get tight, and we owe more and own less, and it's because we keep on running these trade deficits. Because we don't make anything. 9% of the economy is manufacturing. We just need to boost manufacturing. Now, I don't believe you can do that if you have open free trade with China. It's being realistic. You just can't do that. It's impossible. So anyone that's wedded to ultra-liberal free trade thing is just, I'm afraid, history has moved in another place, and you've just lost the plot. And also, you know, I sometimes pull people's legs and say you can only be a free trader if you're a paid-up member of the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, I'm sort of pulling your leg, but that's how serious it is. We need to build, we need to make and build more here.
Sorry. Yes, I agree. I agree 100% with that. As somewhat of a bit of a trade protectionist myself, it is especially here in where I live on the Isle of Sheppey. We used to have a thriving steel industry here. We used to have our very own industries, a thriving port, and because of, you know, cheap imported like goods and labor, it's turned this place into just like the only real industry this place has is tourism, and even that is starting to flail. So yeah, I find it very difficult to find anything I disagree with in that statement.
Yeah, well, that moves us on very nicely into the next question or topic, which is defense and national security. And I think this is an issue that's slightly overlooked, I think, in mainstream discourse and also in policy discussions. So I just would like to sort of flesh out some of the defense and security policies for both parties. How should we respond to growing threat from Russia in Europe, in Ukraine, and also China, you know, bullying its neighbors in the South China Sea. So starting with William Clouston.
Well, these are massive issues. You could have a whole few hours on these. Broadly, I think the mistakes that have been made in respect of Ukraine, I think Ukraine is a nation state, and it's been invaded and has a right, as a just war, for it to resist Russia's aggression. We said that. I think the blind spot in the West has been the potential effect of Russia's counter sanctions on Europe. At the time of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, virtually nothing was said about this. In fact, I think we were the only party that flagged it up, and maybe we were a bit better advised than some of the others. But we knew it would happen. Russia's a full spectrum commodities superpower, and the effect of closing off gas and other supplies overnight has been profound on industrial production, particularly in Germany and Central Europe. But the political discourse at the time of the war was that nothing was happening. The political discourse was that sanctions was something we did to Russia without realizing there would be a cost. From a realistic point of view, it's awful. As a nation state democrat, I think what's happened to Ukraine is absolutely appalling, and I think the invasion is appalling. But politicians should be honest. And my honest answer, do I believe that Russia will be defeated militarily? No, I do not. And if I do not believe that will happen, and by the way, do I believe that Western states should intervene in Ukraine? No, I do not. I think the prospects for extending what is a two-state conflict to a wider, more catastrophic conflict are there. I think history proves that that's a very dangerous thing to do. So I think support Ukraine, yes, but I think in the end, what's going to happen is Ukraine will probably be partitioned. Partition is a much more it's a suboptimal option. It's an awful option. You know, Ireland was partitioned, Cyprus was partitioned, Germany was partitioned, Korea was partitioned, Vietnam was partitioned. Partition is a way of having an armistice, and I think the terrible reality in Ukraine is that the choice is a 10-year, 15-year, 20-year meat grinder, awful, or some sort of armistice of some kind, and I think that's probably wise. Just on China again, and another massive topic. Mm-hmm. China, there's nothing in China's history that has shown or demonstrated that it's concerned for military conquest beyond what it regards as its own. The Taiwanese issue is obviously a live issue, is a problem, is Taiwan again is a democracy. It's an independent state that's not recognized by all other states. But I don't, particularly when American hawks and others talk about China's, America's been quite good at invading other countries. I think the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq were utterly disastrous. And I think that type of foolishness, sort of neocon interventionism, has been disastrous, and we're against that. I think that's just been proven. So you have to find a line which is going to work. But I don't. Again, no one knows. But if you ask me, do I believe that China would be foolish enough to engage in a full-scale military invasion of Taiwan? I do not believe that personally.
Okay, thank you for explaining that, Mr. Fotheringham-Bray.
Yeah. So, national defence, again, I think a lot of what Mr. Clouston says is absolutely correct. We have absolutely no intention to get involved with. Well, we should have absolutely no intention to get involved, boots on the ground in Ukraine, because that's World War III right there. Is Ukraine going to win? No, they do not have the manpower to sustain a long conflict against Russia, and they are likely to be partitioned. So it is from that perspective we as a country need to learn, which is why we need to beef up our military in that regard. But in order to do that, we need to have a sense of pride in our military again, because as we've gone on and as we've seen, more and more polling and more information from especially young people across the United Kingdom, including myself, they don't serve any interest. They don't have any interest in serving the military, and that's simply because they don't like the country they live in. They don't like being British. There's no pride in being British. So it's about, one, defeating that apathy towards the British Armed Forces, where we can find ourselves in a position where that we can, be a perceivable threat to the Russians. I mean, in a one-to-one, I think Britain, even in its current miserable state, can still, defeat the Russians militarily, especially at sea. But it's about making sure that Russia never threatens us, militarily at all, and that's by following Reform UK policy of increasing military spending, by allowing members of the armed forces to gain access to free education once their time in service has finished. And it's about making sure that we retain our armed forces members by actually giving them an incentive to stay in it. And it's also about creating media, and it's about creating media through that will portray the British Army as the proud institution that it is, and the institution that has protected these islands for over 1,000 years. Well, that would be the concept of England, but that our military is something that we desperately need to reinvest in if we want to pose. If we want to reassert ourselves as one of the leading members of NATO, and two, to make sure that foreign threats such as Russia, such as China, although like you say they would never threaten us militarily because they have no need to. It's about establishing us as a power again once more. Is what both me and what a party polity believe in.
Yeah, and William Clouston, would you agree with those points broadly?
Well, I agree that we need to spend more on our military. It's been sadly neglected. I think the military needs much sharper focus. I think they should stop being ludicrous woke policies. Basically the British Army. It's a specialist entity. I mean, the British Army has been a combination of patriotic, quite often upper class. British people and lads from the Northern Council Estates. That's what the British Army was. Now to start thinking that you can have an inclusive military in some way that no, you don't actually want your military to represent your country. It's a specialist entity. I may slightly differ from William on the type of. I mean, I think the biggest issue defence is the scandal ineptitude of procurement. MOD procurement has been, how do you describe it? It's been I better not swear. It's shockingly bad. I mean, when the Russians invaded Ukraine, I made a point in a number of interviews on television that it's not well known, but if you convert the total defence budgets of Germany, France, Russia, and the UK, they're roughly the same.
Yeah.
We don't get the same out of it. And actually, probably the worst example is Germany, who's, for cultural reasons, you can spend $60 billion a year on defence, $1 billion a year on defence, and not get anything that's capable of fighting. So it's partly cultural. You know, your question is partly cultural, but the SDP's policy on procurement would be to not procure. You know, for instance, I'll give you an example. You know, having 2 aircraft carriers, which you can barely get the destroyers and frigates to protect them, is not sensible. And also, I don't think aircraft carriers are a sensible option for us anyway. I mean, the SDP's approach in defence spending would be very defensive on protecting these islands and our interests overseas, and also very concerned with procurement being based on UK manufacturing capability. I think these are the things we've lost. I'm not interested in the UK being just a slot into American foreign policy. I don't want that.
Yeah, no, I think that, well, one of my thoughts was that a stronger industrial policy is needed to increase our military strength, especially looking at Ukraine. And, you know, before Russia invaded, we'd stopped making howitzers, and if you look at ammunition production, we hadn't been making enough ammunition, and we've basically depleted all our stocks. I mean, even other European countries like Denmark gave up all of their shells to Ukraine. So I think that
they've still got a shortage, apparently.
Yeah, and it's strange because you don't often think of left-wing economics and maybe national defense going together, but I think one of the appeals of the SDP is that it does, you know, make the very clear and somewhat common sense point that you do need a big state for national security.
And you need a competent, active state.
Yeah, that's good. And any thoughts on that, Fotheringham-Bray?
In
terms of industrial policy and
I think if you want to have a military that is, you know, stable, you need to have a strong industrial base. So, like, if you want to make lots of boats, you need lots of factories. If you want to make lots of guns, you need lots of factories. It's about winning the industrial battle first before you even like point a gun at someone, because if you win that battle, then you may not even need to fight a physical one. So I'm in agreement with that. Yeah, most certainly.
Yeah. And Max, did you want to contribute?
What I'd say, question I had was, this is somewhere where you two might differ. How should we tackle the cost of living and economic crisis, which is polled as one of the most important things by members of the public?
Yeah. Well, I can answer that by saying we need to make work pay, which is one of our big slogans that we have. So we need to ensure that the people that actually make their money keep their money, because taxes are just because the issue of tax is the issue during a cost of living crisis. So in order to lift people out of, you know, lift people out of poverty and to increase the standard of living, throughout all of history, throughout all time, standard of living increases when taxes go down, because people get to have the money they keep. They keep the money and they can reinvest back into the economy. They can invest back into their lives. They can get onto the property ladder easier. And so it's about lowering taxes, seeing where that goes, and adjusting accordingly. To me, that's just a common sense answer when it comes to lowering the cost, when it comes to tackling the cost of living crisis, personally.
William Clouston?
imagine an island. It's easy to think about this in these terms. So imagine an island somewhere, and the government of that island, it's a small island, the government of the island spends puts a lot of emphasis on building housing sufficient for the population. They overproduce housing, and as a consequence, the cost of housing is cheap. That's a good social outcome. And imagine on the same island that they were quite interested in energy production, and they invested in energy production. It might be hydrocarbons, it might be solar, it might be wind, it might be all sorts of things. But they invested in energy production, and as a consequence, the people on that island ended up with cheap energy and sufficient energy. And in those 2 points I've made is the key to the entire question, cost of living crisis. In this country, housing is so tight. If you look at household budgets, housing is so tight that it can consume 20%, 30% of the entire take-home pay you have. That is a consequence of lack of investment in housing. Energy is just as bad, but people don't see it sort of up front. But you'd be shocked if you looked at the trade. I mean, I'm boring enough to look at the trade figures. The United States' biggest single export to the UK, crude oil. The UK imports circa 50, 60 billion in natural gas and other energy products because we haven't invested in domestic energy supply. And because of that, energy is very expensive. And I love table analogies. I love, in the pub particularly, I love talking about the table. If this table is the household budget, how much are you spending on food? How much are you spending on energy? How much are you spending on housing? Well, if you don't invest in it, it's gonna cost you more. And that's been the fundamental problem. A lot of people William's made a point on tax, fair enough, but the reason we have high taxes is because we've deindustrialized and we're paying a lot in benefits because we're knackered in the northern towns, in the Midlands and the north. That's why. I mean, that's basically the reason. The deindustrialization is tremendously expensive, socially and economically. And it would have been far cheaper to keep the factories open and to have a trade policy that at least was aware of trade deficits and the need to eliminate them. So it's all downstream of that until you can address these fundamental issues and invest. It will be expensive for households. That's the consequence.
Yeah, and I actually have maybe some more difficult questions for both of you, because one of the reasons the SDP appeals to me more than Reform is because I feel like the SDP actually has more of a supply side housing policy, whereas Reform says it's all about immigration. So I suppose that would be my question to you, Fotheringham-Bray. But also, I'd like to know what both of you think about the free market libertarian argument that you can just get rid of planning laws or get rid of the green belts. So I'll start with you, William, Reform William, and then move on to William Clouston.
Well, when it comes to the housing, it's not my area of greatest expertise. I often talk to another PPC about that. Paul, he's very focused on when it comes to housing. So the best I can do is just quote Reform policy in regards to housing. So in regards to housing, I agree, and I very much liked William Clouston's analogy when it comes, investing into housing. I can't really see myself disagreeing in any way with that. No, housing is not my area.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, William, you have experience. You know a lot about town planning.
Yeah. Well, first, can I say, William, all credit. I mean, what the country is looking for is politicians that are honest, and William's just been straight there, and you deserve credit for it. It's better just to say, if you don't know the answer, I'm not sure, I'll check it. Far better to do that than to do the opposite. Housing. I am at a slight disadvantage in politics because I've built a few houses and I'm a town planner by trade and a surveyor, so I do know about it. We won't solve. You can't solve one. I was, again, another little analogy. post-war, under both Tory and Labour governments, the private sector and the public sector built about the same, but actually the public sector built a bit more, and that changed in 1970, and then private sector built a bit more. But the public sector bit's been just taken off, and it's a bit like, as a metaphor, it's a bit like, getting a bird and chopping one of its wings off and thinking, why doesn't it fly? It can't fly because it doesn't. Part of the capacity has been removed. And my opponents on the libertarian right, when they're talking about housing, always talk about the planning system or street votes or a lot of other sort of quite niche ideas. By the way, William, SW1, SW1 is not where you'll find the answers to any question. The place is chock-a-block full of think tanks that are paid for by the house builders, and they're paid to basically to put BS out about this issue. The reason that the planning reform can't solve the housing crisis is that planning reform without state sector capacity doesn't do anything. I mean, it doesn't. The state, the registered social landlords and housing associations build about 40,000 homes a year. The private sector builds about 150. That's the size of the sector. Now, unless and people say, "Oh, we should build 300." Well, don't be stupid. Where are we going to get if that's the size of the sector, and there's a shortage of bricklayers anyway? How do you expect suddenly, out of thin air, to build three? It can't do it. What you've got to do is build capacity. And when the SDP looked at it, we asked for three things. We wanted the entities to build the houses, the funding, and the powers, which are the three things you need if you want to get the sector back into business. And it would take us 5 years to do it. But at least we're realistic and honest about how to do it. You can't planning control. It doesn't. If you gave planning consent for 2 million new homes, they couldn't build it. They couldn't. And by the way, they wouldn't, because it's not in their interest to.
Yeah.
Most private house builders land bank, and they drip houses into the market slowly, because then prices remain high. So I'm afraid unless we get the state back involved, then your generation, guys, you won't. You're going to struggle, and it's a bugger, because I think you're entitled to a house and to the chance to raise a family.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I'd agree with that. And I think it's good that you tied that into family as well, because I suppose that's another thing that makes the SDP quite distinct among the parties. Well, I think we've covered a lot. How about some final statements regarding?
I'd like to say this has been very educational for me. It's definitely highlighted areas in which I'm at my weakest. It's clear to me that someone who doesn't own my own home, I'm very foggy. It's quite foggy about areas when it comes to housing policy. So I thank you for your patience in regards to my ignorance when it comes to that subject. But yeah, no, you've definitely given me a lot to think about. All of you, really.
Well, thank you very much for coming on. We know that you have people have busy lives. But yeah, William, perhaps touching on that family point, because I think that is perhaps the one issue that is not talked about, and there's a real taboo around it. But yeah, do you have any last final thoughts?
Well, just firstly, thank you very much for the invite, and all the best, William. I've enjoyed hearing what you're saying, and I say never ever. Always have the bottle to tell the truth. If you don't know, say you don't know. It's fine. It's absolutely fine. But people respect that.
I was raised by police, Mr. Clouston. I know nothing but the truth. Otherwise, I'll get it ringed out of me.
Anyway, so but on family, yeah. I mean, our policies, the SDPs. Well, I mean, one of the things we do have, we're quite a small party, but we are very confident in our philosophical base, and the SDP is all about faith, flag, and family. The three places where we come together. That's it. Unless, I mean, all's well in the world if family is strong. And I think a lot of our problems are caused by the crisis of the family, which has lots of causes. But until we talk about it, I think we're going to solve it. And so we're happy to do so. And you take a little bit of you do take a little bit of a knock if you're pro-family, but I don't. We're not in the business. You can't be a softie in politics. You've got to say what you believe, and then another thing I say quite often, which I think is right, is that if you don't agree with us, don't vote for us. Don't vote for us. Vote for someone else.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, and yeah, William, thank you both for coming on.
All the best.